So, I know what the Bulgarians watching my last episode were undoubtedly thinking. But what about the Bitola inscription, Mario? Really got you there, didn't we? Well, I appreciate you wasting your time and flooding my comment section with mostly incoherent nonsense, assuming you've presented me with new information and I'd be caught off guard. It's touching, truly, though a bit misplaced. So, what are you going to do now? I mean, are you going to remind me that Basil was actually called Basil the Bulgar Slayer, like I didn't already know this? Or better yet, show me the text of Gotadelchev's letter to Malishevsky? I mean, wow, mind-altering evidence you have there, folks. Next dimension, even. But in all seriousness, to the folks actually tuning in with an open mind, I know who you are. I'm going to state that when discussing the Bitola inscription, I'm not going to definitively state that one interpretation of this stone slab is correct over the other. What I am going to show is that there is much more debate and speculation over its decipherment than the average Bulgarian propagandists are showing you online. Remember, they want you to think it's always been an open and shut case to corner you and to get you to swallow the Bulgarian pill. Of course, we're not going to let that happen. You're watching Mario's History Talks. I'm Mario Rostovsky, and we have a great show for you this evening. So, let's get started. Now, an important context to consider before we get into the meat and potatoes here is the following. As you know, the Bulgars do have a history with fabricating stone inscriptions to show a blatantly Bulgarian character to the medieval inhabitants of Macedonia as well as his rulers. You will remember from watching my previous episode entitled Bulgarian Photoshop Fails that in September of 1997, a Greek citizen with a Bulgarian identity named Stoidis, he came forward to the authorities having a stone inscription in his possession. He claimed to have found at a local church in Vodin. And it was the Bulgar's own Božidar Dimitrov, director of the Bulgarian National Historical Museum, who declared it to be a 19th century fabrication. Yes, that same anti-Macedonian chauvinist Dimitrov. Oh, in case you didn't remember what he looked like, here's a photo of him posing with a historically accurate recreation of a Bulgar soldier from the Middle Ages. Hello, fellow Slavs, am I right? Now, I'm not claiming that this is the case here, but it also cannot be definitively ruled out either. One of the most groundbreaking, new, and original studies of Samuel's state and its legacy on modern Balkan nationalism is called Blinded State by Mitko Panov, and he does not rule out this possibility entirely either. So, with that in mind, let's take a deeper dive. So, the first thing you have to realize is that almost 99% of the photos you see of the Bitola inscription are, in fact, reconstructed extrapolations of what the missing text might say. Remember, this was found in 1956 during the demolition of a mosque in Bitola. It had been used as a doorstep for people entering the mosque for centuries before this, and that text is faint and extremely damaged. Here's what the inscription actually has written. Pretty different from what your average Bulgarian internet troll spams you with. Now, here's what happened. After it was discovered in a mosque in 1956, it was actually not until about 1970 that it was attempted to be fully deciphered by Bulgarian scientists by the name of Jordan Zaimov, as well as his wife Vasilika Tapkova Zaimova, in a publication by the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Now, remember, by this time period, tensions between Bulgaria and Yugoslavia were at an all-time high, especially over the legacy of Tsar Samuel, who both sides were very eager to cast in terms of their own national identity and in terms of their own history. But, of course, this reading by Zaimov immediately casts some doubts on it, as should all hypotheses. I mean, we always want to test and scrutinize any assumptions. So, among the critics of the text was Professor Horace Lunt, a linguist working in the field of Slavic studies and Professor Emeritus at the Slavic Language and Literature Department, as well as the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard University. Among other accomplishments, Professor Lunt published numerous monographs, articles, essays, and reviews on all aspects of Slavic comparative and historical linguistics, as well as some aspects of philology. And he was the first one to write the English grammar version of the Macedonian language in the early 1950s. And of course, because he accepted the reality of the Macedonian language, as well as the disagreement with the reconstructed text of the Bitola Inscription, this Harvard professor has been labeled a fringe Macedonist by Jingibi of Wikipedia, as if it were somehow an insult and damaging to his credibility. Yes, thank you, Professor Jingibi. Next time, try to disguise your barely literate English language edits to our articles on Wikipedia. It's embarrassing. Now, among the reservations that Professor Lund had with the stone, he starts out with the obvious, that early Cyrillic inscriptions are notoriously difficult to date, even to begin with. In fact, given how faint and faded the text actually is, Lunt went as far as to say as Zaimov and his wife completely falsified the contents of the plaque to draw a conclusion from what they wanted and not the truth. Direct quote there. Yikes. Now, in fact, other researchers also shared this position, criticizing the obviously very loose and imaginative reading of the missing text by Zaimov, among which is Byzantine historian and researcher Paul Stevenson, author of the monumental book, The Legend of Basil the Bulgar Slayer. He says, Zaimov, provides where the writing is lost, a solid date for the inscription, around 1015 to 1016, the names of both Samuel and Basil, names and details of the battles of Stipon and Kleidon, and based off this, he suggests that this all must be treated with extreme caution. Direct quote there. Now, back to Lunt. When it comes to the actual supposed date of the inscription, which, remember, this was written using an alphanumeric system, he points out that the reading, which leads to the year of 1014, which would place it within the time period of Ivan Vladislav, Tsar Samuel's nephew, that part of the text is actually very worn away. And most depictions that do show a date actually have that either filled in or artificially enhanced. So, while Lunt argues that the 6 and the final 2 of the year can be made out, remember, this is a dating system starting from the biblical understanding of the creation of the world, so around the 6000s, he states that the figure that Zaimov made out to be the Greek letter phi, Lunt points out it also resembles what could possibly be psi. And while the letter next to that could be a K as claimed, but it could also potentially be an M, mu, given the spacing that's available. So given that, Lunt does argue against a 1014 dating based off a sigma, phi, kappa, beta reading, but rather a 1234 reading, which is 6742, which he says fits beautifully with not only the orthography and the language, but identifies Ivan with Ivan Osan II, who ruled Macedonia in 1230. But who was Ivan Osan II? Well, long story short, he was the son of Ivan Osan I, one of the co-emperors of the Vlacho-Bulgarian Empire, also known as the Second Bulgarian Empire, along with his brother Peter. Now, I do call it a Vlacho-Bulgarian Empire since many sources do describe it as such, and many other primary sources actually describe the two brothers as being Vlachs themselves, even though the name Osan is actually Turkic in origin. And you thought the legacy of the Bulgars was completely gone by this time period. Crazy stuff. But anyway, what's important here is that these leaders of the Vlacho-Bulgarian Empire, despite their origins, did believe themselves to be Bulgarian, and essentially took the Byzantine imperial propaganda regarding Tsar Samuel's state and essentially turned it against them to claim not only descent and legitimacy from the first Bulgarian Empire, but also from Samuel's state as well. Now, of course, we know this to be fictitious and an attempt at a power grab, but its leaders later on, like Kaloyan, even went as far as to press the Catholic Church to back its claims and grant him legitimacy. Pope Innocent, in return, was not able to find such a backing within the Vatican archives, and he stopped short of naming Kaloyan emperor. And it was precisely around this time that Basil II gained his notorious nickname, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. However, in this context, it was meant to be projected towards the new enemies of the Byzantine Empire, the Vlacho-Bulgarian state. So, while Basil still fought against Samuel's armies historically, Bulgar Slayer was now used as a form of deterrence against the Vlacho-Bulgarian Empire to inspire the fear and the image of Basil II in the hearts of the enemies of that empire. Now, before this time, he was known as Basil Purpurogenitus, Basil born of the purple. So, what I want you to take away from this is that if the identity of this autocrat mentioned in the inscription is indeed Ivan Osan II, he would have been perfectly in line claiming descent from Samuel himself, however fictitious this actually was. Again, the leaders of this rebellion that resulted in the Second Bulgarian Empire used the Byzantine imperial propaganda against them, vis-a-vis the theme of Bulgaria, and Samuel's state, being by this time remembered as Bulgarian because of that, to essentially claim legitimacy for their own empire's foundations. Remember, Samuel's state only became Bulgarian when Basil II renamed the conquered territory the theme of Bulgaria to establish the notion of Byzantine ecclesiastical as well as administrative dominance in that area from beginning to end. References to Basil II now fighting Bulgarians were a bit misleading, since Byzantines often used both ancient and current identities for groups of people interchangeably. While they did not specifically name neither Samuel nor the inhabitants of his state as Bulgarians in contemporary sources, choosing rather to mask their identities by using terms such as Scythians and Mesians, terms that they also used for other groups that were not actually the historical Bulgars, like the Rus and the Vlachs. After that territory became Byzantine, became reconquered, and became known as the theme of Bulgaria, they would start retroactively using the term Bulgarian, thinking of the inhabitants of that territory, even when talking and speaking about the past. Now, notwithstanding Lund's other issues with the text, other linguists and archaeologists have also found some other inconsistencies with Zaimov's analysis, among which was Professor Robert Mathiasen, who was Professor Emeritus of Slavic and Medieval Studies at Brown University. Again, another not credible Macedonist, this time from the podunk little university called Brown University. So he took a deeper dive into the actual style of the text itself, and he noted some inconsistencies with the actual engravings and letter styles themselves. He notes major inconsistencies with how different three letters he identified were written across the different lines of the text. To him, it shows evidence of not one, but two stonecutters working on this inscription, and he also agrees there is a lot of uncertainty over its dating. He basically says as long as its true age does remain in doubt, the evidence of the Bitola inscription will have to be used with great caution. However, he does still point out this doesn't lessen at all the historical cultural importance of the Cyrillic paleography, which is seen here by the works of these two stonecutters. But whatever the outcome of when and if the doubts are finally laid to rest, it'll have to be treated with extreme caution. But at the end of the day, folks, here's what we have to understand. The inscription could also very well be authentic. I'm not discounting that. And could also very well be from the time of Ivan Vladislav, who a lot of credible Western researchers also suggest. Like I said, this is far from settled. And if this is authentic, it does still clearly show the words Bulgarski and Bulgarum on it. And unfortunately, most Macedonians freeze up when they see this. Again, this is what the Bulgars want you to do. This is how they want you to act. You have to remember, as always, modern nationalities are a far cry from any medieval identities. Whoever the autocrat is behind this inscription, it really doesn't matter too much when looked at in context. The Bulgarian label, just like the opposing Roman label, were both mainly political constructs of this time period. While both were undoubtedly based off an actual foundational ethnic group, the actual Bulgars and the actual Romans, centuries later, these labels would become twisted and contorted to suit newfound political dimensions. And even if we do take these identities and we take them at face value, here's the implications we would be left with. Samuel, who was most likely, not for sure, but most likely Armenian, he becomes Bulgarian. Peter and Osan, most likely Vlachs, they also become Bulgarian. And Basil I, who was an Armenian, he would have become Macedonian since he created the Byzantines' Macedonian dynasty. Now, despite all this, Bulgars want you to think that every single time that you see the word Bulgarian, no matter the context nor the historicity of it, it will always refer to their people and ethnos alone. But when we see the Turkic proto-Bulgars mentioned, we have to slow down and remember that the Bulgars and Bulgarians are not actually the same people. After all, one are called Bulgari, while the other, they're called Bulgari. Oy vey. But listen, the lesson here is it's simply not up to us to contextualize with our modern notions of identities what these abstract and loose political constructs of the Middle Ages could have meant to the person writing this. Even if Samuel's nephew did consider himself to be successor to the Bulgarian Empire, and even a Bulgarian himself, this does not speak one iota as to how the people felt and viewed themselves, nor does it change the actual facts surrounding their origins. So remember, nothing can truly be black and white in history. The Bulgars, they have hit their high water mark. They have hoped with enough pressure we would accept a soft Bulgarian identity to gain entry into the EU. They were wrong. And now, seeing the isolation and the backlash that they're facing for their short-sighted stupidity, they want you to think that the Bulgarian pill is just somehow magically being swallowed all across Macedonia when it's simply not the case. We will never embrace Bulgarianism. And as Krista Petkov-Misirkov, the great Macedonian, said, whose birthday was just a week ago, Bulgaria is the greatest demon we have to battle. So, be armed with facts, never be caught off guard, and never, ever give up on Macedonia. You know I'll be with you every step of the way. So, keep fighting for Macedonia, stay safe, reach out to me if you do need anything, and as always, I'll see you again soon. Golem patriotski pozdrav. Take care, folks.